You're standing there for a moment longer than you meant to. Not stuck, not overwhelmed, just still. The room feels fuller than it looks, like the air itself is carrying something extra. Your eyes move slowly, passing over familiar things, but nothing quite settles your attention. I remember that feeling well. Standing in my own space, realizing the room wasn't asking to be cleaned or fixed. It was asking to be understood. There was a quiet pressure in it, a sense that every surface, every corner, was holding on to something unfinished. Not noise, expectation. And the longer I stood there, the clearer it became that the heaviness wasn't about mess at all. It was about how much had been carried for a very long time, without pause. After carrying that feeling for so long, your eyes land on something small and ordinary, and you realize it isn't the thing itself that's heavy. It's who you've been holding it for. That thought came to me quietly, without drama. Someone might need this. I'd said it so many times over the years that it felt like part of my breathing. I remember standing there, touching the edge of a shelf and noticing how familiar that sentence was. I'd used it to explain away a lot. Extra dishes kept neatly stacked. Clothes still in good shape, folded and saved. A box moved from one place to another without ever being opened. None of it felt wrong. It felt responsible. It felt like being prepared. And for a long time, that mattered to me. Somewhere along the way, I became the one who held things for other people. I didn't decide it out loud. It just happened. I was dependable. I thought ahead. I made room. And even when the calls stopped coming, even when lives shifted and needs changed, I stayed ready. Standing there, I could feel how long I'd been on standby without noticing. What surprised me wasn't how much I'd kept, but how tired that role had made me. Not a sharp tiredness, a quiet one, the kind that settles into your shoulders over years. These things weren't asking to be used anymore. They were asking me to keep waiting. And once I saw that, clearly and calmly, something eased. I didn't feel careless for noticing it. I felt relieved, because I hadn't failed anyone by holding on. I had done what I knew how to do for a very long time, and realizing that meant I didn't have to keep proving it. I could let that role rest. And as that understanding settled gently, my attention turned inward, toward what I had been carrying for myself all along. And once my attention settled there, I could feel something else underneath it all. A familiar hum. The part of me that never really learned how to stop. I smiled a little when I noticed it, because I've known that part of myself for a long time. The one who could carry more than expected. The one people counted on. I used to do things without planning for them, without bracing myself. I'd lift, fix, organize, manage, all in one motion and think nothing of it. Back then, effort felt like air. You didn't notice it because it was everywhere. I remember laughing once, standing in my kitchen, realizing how much I used to get through before lunch. Not in a boastful way, more in disbelief, as if I were remembering someone else. And yet that version of me was still living in the room, quietly setting the standard. Every sturdy item, every tool kept just in case, every piece of furniture that assumed strength I no longer needed to prove. They were all small reminders of how capable I had been, and how capable I still felt I was supposed to be. What I hadn't noticed until then was how easily pride turns into pressure. Effort becomes expectation, so gradually you don't feel the shift. You just keep up. You keep storing things you can handle, things you could manage, things that make sense for a body and a pace you once had. And none of it feels wrong. It feels respectful. It feels like honoring the work you put in over a lifetime. But standing there, feeling it honestly, I could sense how much energy it took to keep living up to that old rhythm. Those objects weren't just useful, they were evidence. Proof that I was still the person who could do it all without thinking. And that's when it landed differently. Letting go of one of those things didn't feel like disrespecting my past. It felt like finally giving that hard-working version of me permission to sit down. There was a softness in that realization, almost a kindness. I didn't need to erase who I had been. I just didn't need to keep asking myself to perform at that level anymore. And as that expectation loosened, even slightly, I noticed something I hadn't heard before. A quiet, emotional noise beneath the effort. Old tension, unfinished feelings, things that had been drowned out by staying busy for years. Once the work eased, they finally had room to be heard. When the effort eased, I noticed a few things I'd been ignoring. Some items felt heavier than others, even though they weren't. I picked one up and knew right away it wasn't about what it was. It was about where it came from. A moment that never fully settled. I stood there with it in my hands and remembered how it entered my life. Not through a big argument or a painful scene, just a conversation that stopped short. Something said, something left hanging. At the time, I didn't know what to do with how it felt, so I kept the item instead. It was easier to store the thing than to sort through the feeling. Years passed, and it stayed right where I put it, carrying that moment quietly. What struck me was how often I'd done that without realizing it. I hadn't been holding on to objects, I'd been holding on to unfinished moments, little pieces of life that didn't get resolved because there was no space for them back then, no time. No energy. So they found a place on a shelf instead. They weren't dramatic. They didn't demand attention. But they never went away either. Seeing it clearly didn't upset me. It explained something I'd been feeling for a long time. The heaviness in the room wasn't clutter. It was emotional residue. A few items still doing a job they were never meant to do. Holding feelings I didn't have room for when they first showed up. Once I recognized that, the weight shifted. Not everything felt lighter, but it felt more honest. I stayed still for a moment after that. I didn't rush myself. This kind of noticing takes more out of you than lifting ever did. It isn't physical effort, it's attention. And attention, especially the honest kind, gets tired. I could feel it in my chest, in the way my shoulders dropped a little when I stopped pushing myself to keep going. After that pause, the room felt quieter, not empty, just clearer. And in that quiet, something else made itself known, a familiar hesitation. I could feel it without looking directly at it yet. Things I'd kept because I hadn't decided what they were for. Not sentimental. Not useful, just unresolved. They weren't asking to be kept or thrown away. They were waiting on a decision I'd been postponing. That was different from the earlier wait. This wasn't emotional, it was mental. The low hum of maybe later, just in case, I'll think about it another time. And standing there, I could finally feel how much energy that quiet indecision had been taking simply by staying unresolved. And once I felt that, I could see it more clearly. Things that weren't really meant to stay, but weren't ready to leave either. Items kept because they were close enough to useful to avoid a decision. Not broken, not needed, just almost the right size, almost a good idea, almost worth keeping. I realized how often I'd been living around that word. Almost. It sounds practical, sensible even. But standing there, I could feel how it split my attention. Every almost asked me to remember it later, to reconsider it someday, to keep a small part of my mind tied up just in case. None of these things demanded much on their own, but together they kept my thoughts scattered, never quite settling. I thought back to how many times I'd moved the same things from one place to another, telling myself I'd decide later. Later felt harmless. Later felt responsible. But later kept me hovering. I wasn't using these things, and I wasn't releasing them either. They stayed in that middle space, quietly asking for future energy I never quite had. What changed for me was noticing how clean my mind felt when one of those almosts was gone. Not dramatic, just quieter, like finishing a thought that had been left open too long. It didn't feel like waste, it felt like closure, as if I'd finally put a period where a sentence had been trailing off for years. That's when I understood that practicality can turn into strain without you realizing it. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because your mind was never meant to hold that many unfinished decisions at once. Letting one go didn't take effort, it released it. And once that happened, my attention stopped bouncing around the room. With fewer of those half-decisions hanging in the air, I noticed something else I hadn't seen clearly before. Time. Not rushing time. Just time showing itself. How long things had been waiting. How long I'd been saying someday without checking whether that day was still coming. And once that thought surfaced, gently and honestly, it stayed with me, asking to be noticed next. And once I noticed time like that, it was hard not to see how many things were waiting on it. Not broken, not forgotten, just set aside for later. I could spot them easily once I knew what I was looking at. Clothes kept for outings that hadn't happened yet. Items saved for a version of life that always seemed just a little further ahead. I didn't feel sad about them. I felt clear. Clear in a way that surprised me. I remember holding one thing and trying to recall when I'd decided it was for later. I couldn't. Later had never been a date. It was just a habit. A way of saying not now without ever checking back in. Over the years, later had quietly shifted forward year by year, carrying these things with it. And I realized I'd been waiting alongside them, without meaning to. That thought didn't come with regret. It came with honesty. Life hadn't stalled. It had simply moved. My days had filled with different rhythms, different comforts, different needs. But some of my belongings were still waiting for an older plan to resume. And standing there, I could feel how gently out of place that was. What stayed with me most was how calm it felt to choose now instead. Not in a rushed way, not as a decision forced by age or urgency, just a quiet preference for comfort in the present. I didn't need to save certain things for a moment that kept moving away. I could let today be enough. That felt dignified, earned. I noticed how my body responded to that shift. My shoulders eased, my breathing slowed. There was relief in no longer postponing enjoyment, ease, or usefulness. Nothing dramatic changed in the room, but something important changed in me. I stopped measuring life against a future version and started noticing what fit the life I was actually living. And once that settled, another awareness followed close behind. If I was no longer waiting on later, then the question wasn't about time anymore. It was about safety, about why I'd kept certain things close, even when they no longer matched my days. That recognition came quietly too, asking to be noticed next. And when I stayed with that thought, it led me somewhere familiar. Not forward, but back. back to a time when having more meant being safer. I grew up learning that you didn't rely on one of anything if you could help it. If something worked, you kept another. If it might be useful, you didn't let it go too easily. That wasn't fear. It was common sense then. It was how you made sure tomorrow didn't catch you off guard. I could see that instinct all around me. 2 of the same item, sometimes 3. Not because I needed them all, but because at one point needing one and not having it felt worse than carrying extras. I remembered how steady that made me feel back then, knowing I had a backup, knowing I wouldn't be stuck. Those duplicates weren't careless, they were smart ones, they were earned. What changed wasn't the habit at first. What changed was the world around it. Slowly, without any announcement, things became easier to replace. Help became easier to reach. My days stopped requiring that level of readiness. But the habit stayed, long after the reason for it had faded. Standing there, I could feel how automatic it had been to keep preparing for a shortage that no longer existed. I remember the moment it really clicked for me. I was looking for something simple and realized I had several versions of it, all tucked away. Instead of feeling secure, I felt tired. Not anxious, just worn out from guarding against something that hadn't happened in years. That's when I understood that safety had changed shape. It wasn't something I needed to store anymore. It was something I already had. That recognition didn't make me careless. It made me calm. I didn't feel the need to stay alert in the same way. The room felt steadier, quieter. Those extra items stopped feeling protective and started feeling unnecessary. Not wrong, just out of season. And once that sense of safety settled in, fully and without argument, something else became possible. I could look at what had changed in my life without bracing myself, without defending old habits. With that vigilance gone, even briefly, I could finally acknowledge the shifts I'd been moving around for a while, waiting patiently to be seen. And once I could see things that clearly there were a few items that asked for a different kind of attention. Not because they were tied to other people, or effort, or safety, but because they quietly marked a change I never stopped to announce. I didn't notice it at first. I just felt a slight hesitation when I looked at them. A pause that wasn't indecision, more like recognition. I remember standing there and realizing some things belonged to a pace I no longer lived at. Not better or worse, just different. Tools I used easily once, items meant for energy I had without thinking about it. I hadn't kept them out of denial. I'd kept them because the change happened slowly, so slowly that there was no clear moment to mark it. No conversation, no goodbye. Life simply adjusted, and these things stayed where they were. There was no sadness in noticing that, and no need to explain it away. It felt more like acknowledging weather that had already passed, a season that did its job and moved on. I didn't feel like I was losing anything by seeing it clearly. I felt honest, calm, as if I were finally speaking something that had been understood for a long time, but never said. I noticed how gently the body reacts when you stop asking it to match an old rhythm. The tension eases, the comparison fades. These objects weren't reminders of loss, they were markers of change. And change doesn't always need fixing or reframing. Sometimes it just needs to be seen. Standing there, I didn't rush to decide anything. I didn't need to. The recognition itself was enough. It didn't demand action. It didn't ask for acceptance speeches or explanations. It simply settled in quietly, the way truth does when you stop arguing with it. And once that settled, I became aware of the space around me in a new way. Not just what the objects meant, but how the room itself felt, the way it held light, the way it asked to be used. My attention, no longer pulled inward, began to move outward, toward the space I was actually living in now, waiting patiently for me to notice it. And as I took that in, I started to feel the room itself again. Not what it held, but how it held me. There was a tightness I hadn't noticed before, a sense of needing to stay alert, even at home. My eyes didn't rest easily. They kept moving, scanning, adjusting. It wasn't clutter, exactly. It was visual noise. Too many signals asking to be managed. I remember realizing that I wasn't exhaling when I walked in anymore. I was bracing. The space felt busy even when nothing was happening. Corners felt full, surfaces felt crowded. Not with mess, but with things that asked to be kept, remembered or handled someday. The home I'd meant to be a place of rest had slowly taken on the role of storage. That recognition landed gently but firmly. I had built a life where my home once supported me. Somewhere along the way it started asking more than it gave back. Not intentionally, just gradually. Piece by piece. And standing there, I could feel how much peace I'd been trading for keeping things that no longer added to my days. What surprised me was how quickly my body responded to that thought. My shoulders dropped, my breathing slowed. It became clear that peace mattered more to me now than preserving every possibility. More than saving items for reasons that no longer fit. I didn't need my space to hold my past, my backup plans, and my future all at once. I needed it to hold me. I thought about how little it takes to feel at ease. Light coming in without interruption. Clear surfaces that don't ask questions. Space that lets you move without thinking ahead. None of that requires perfection. It just requires room. And that room had been there all along, waiting to be allowed. As I stood there, the relief felt close. Not dramatic, not sudden, just within reach. Like knowing you're almost home after a long day. Everything I'd noticed so far, the roles, the effort, the waiting, the old protections, the quiet changes, they all seemed to be pointing in the same direction. Toward ease, toward permission, toward a simpler understanding that was ready to surface once everything else had been seen. And once that understanding settled, everything lined up in a way that felt almost obvious. It hadn't started with picking things up or deciding what stayed. It started much earlier, in a quieter place. What I'd really been letting go of wasn't objects at all. It was pressure. The steady, unspoken kind that tells you to keep up, to hold on, to stay ready, to justify every choice. I could feel how long I'd been carrying expectations that no longer belonged to this part of my life. Expectations to be prepared for every possibility, to honour every past version of myself by keeping proof of it, to delay comfort until everything was settled. Once I noticed that, the pressure eased on its own. Not all at once, just enough to breathe differently. That's when the room changed. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because I wasn't asking it to carry my obligations anymore. Without that weight, it became clear which things mattered and which were simply filling space out of habit. The decisions didn't feel heavy. They didn't even feel like decisions. They felt like natural responses to a body and a life that wanted ease. Looking back, it made sense why nothing moved before this. I'd been trying to change the surface without touching what was underneath. Once the pressure lifted, the rest followed quietly. Objects that had felt important lost their grip. Others found their place without effort. There was no forcing, no proving, just a steady alignment between what I needed now and what surrounded me. I remember noticing how calm I felt in that moment. Not accomplished, not finished, just settled. As if I'd finally stopped asking myself to live up to something that no longer applied. The space didn't demand anything from me anymore. It supported me, and that shift didn't come from doing more. It came from allowing less. What stayed with me most was the simplicity of it. Nothing had been wrong. Nothing needed fixing. I had simply reached a point where permission mattered more than possession. And once I gave myself that permission, everything else fell into place in its own time, without urgency, without effort, exactly as it needed to. So I let one small area stay unfinished. Not as a statement, not as a decision I explained to myself. I just stopped before fixing it. And nothing bad happened. The room didn't close in. The day didn't feel incomplete. What I felt instead was ease. A quiet signal that I didn't have to keep proving I was done in order to be at rest. That's when I understood what enough actually feels like. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with relief or pride. It's simple. It shows up when you stop asking more of yourself than the moment requires. When you allow something to remain ordinary and still feel settled. What matters to me now is that sense of companionship in it. Knowing you can move gently. Knowing you can pause without falling behind. Knowing that noticing one small thing is already progress, even if nothing else changes today. That steadiness is worth more than finishing. I'm grateful you stayed in this space with me. There's something comforting about moving this way, without rushing, without pressure, just paying attention to what feels right. And wherever you are after this, I hope the room feels kinder, quieter, like it's working with you, not asking from you. And if you find yourself pausing again later, that's okay. We can always start from there, calmly, when it feels right.